Karthik, it's a pleasure having you here. I'm talking to Karthik Muralidharan, Assistant Professor at the University of California at San Diego, and an ardent follower of everything that's going on in particularly education in India. Also a participant now 2 times at the India Policy Forum where we are. And Karthik, we had the great pleasure of having you present a paper the first time you came to the IPF. What I wanted to ask you was what led you to think about and agree to doing a paper at the IPF, and maybe we can talk a bit about what you got out of presenting the paper, and perhaps as importantly or more importantly, what you feel the policy community in Delhi got out of that paper.
So I think, as an academic economist, most of the focus is on writing high-quality individual papers. Your audience is kind of a global audience of referees who are looking for the most technically high-quality pieces of work. And this is mostly what I've been doing, and that's kind of, like I mentioned, in fact, in my IPF talk last year, it was ironic that this was at NCAER because a lot of my research agenda here started with the other thing that NCER does with the NBER and the Nirvana conferences. And so I've been working in this area for 10 years, and it's kind of been increasingly frustrating to see the gap between where the research has moved and where the policy environment has been. And now it's not, in some sense, it's not fair to blame the policymakers because they're just too busy fighting day-to-day fires and don't really have either the time or the bandwidth to distill what the researchers are finding. And so I think the timing for the paper turned out pretty nicely because there'd been about a decade of high-quality empirical research, some of it which I'd worked on, some of which with people like Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo and folks from JPAL had been working on. So there was a body of knowledge which made sense to synthesize in a way that fed into the 12th five-year plan. So the timing just worked out well. And so when I gave that public lecture at NCAER, summarizing a lot of the work we'd done in Andhra Pradesh, I think, summarizing a lot of the work we did in Andhra Pradesh, I think you came to me after that and said that that was really well received, and I think we got about over 100 people at like 2 days' notice. And so clearly there was, I think, a hunger and a thirst for well-presented, well-synthesized, high-quality academic work in a way that could make sense to policymakers. And so when you said, do you want to write something as a follow-up, it kind of just made perfect sense. And I think, people like Dr. Monte Ahluwalia, who I've known for a long time, has often kind of chided or castigated me for not doing more of this sort. Perhaps, saying that, yes, it's fine to write these individual papers, you come give these presentations in the Planning Commission and we clap and say good job, but there's no follow-up, because there's no institutional way of bringing that knowledge into the policy sphere. And so this paper was kind of my first attempt to, having worked in this area for 10 years, to synthesize things in a way that were both true to the technical rigor of the research, but then simplified it enough to be completely comprehensible and distill certain policy lessons from that. So it was a useful experience for me, and going by the reactions of Dr. Jadhav and others from the Planning Commission who were there, it looks like hopefully it was a useful exercise for the government as well.
What happened after you gave the paper, and can you trace through perhaps some of the impact that it might have had, has had, that you feel it will have?
So I think, in a way it was, like they say, luck is when preparation meets opportunity, and so impact is when the supply meets the demand, right? And so it was, if it was just a paper that somebody wrote, without a policy window, then perhaps it wouldn't have had the kind of impact it did. At the same time, there are policy windows when people are looking for inputs, but there often isn't high quality technical work that exists for you to summarize. In that sense, I think it was a very fortuitous coincidence in terms of timing. So the paper itself was based on really sound empirical research, and Dr. Jadhav, I think, who has a PhD in economics, and the senior people in the Planning Commission are all serious economists, and they pretty much quickly gathered that the work was technically very sound and that it had implications for policy. So I think what ended up happening after that session was Dr. Jadhav, as he said, that wanted to go back and rework a lot of the plan document on the basis of that chapter, and then he asked me to give him certain snippets and extracts that synthesized even more succinctly some of the main points. And I think then within the process of the government, they worked a lot of that into the final draft of the 12th plan. So that was as far as the Planning Commission document itself happened. But I think, I worked with them to kind of take the next step, which is to say, now that this is in the plan document, I mean, where the real action now and the challenge is then working with the Education Ministry to convert what's in the plan document into implementable, actionable, scalable strategies. And so what I've been doing since March this year, when I first met with the Cabinet Minister of Education, is to then do a series of structured workshops with MHRD. And I did one in late May, for 3 hours, attended by the Cabinet Minister, the Minister of State, the Chief Economic Advisor was there, and the entire senior bureaucracy from the Secretary down were there. And so that was a really good 3-hour discussion, and we're now following that up, in fact, tomorrow, they have invited 7 principal secretaries of education from the states to come and kind of hear the paper and hear certain core policy recommendations. And I think at the end of the day, it's important to recognize the limitations of how far the academic research can push policy, because the policymakers obviously face administrative and practical constraints that can mean, and so one needs to marry the technical research with feasibility. So I think the right way to do this is to kind of present the research, present the results that can mean, and then let the policymakers react to it, and then have a dialogue on what parts of the research results are then actionable and implementable, and then work with them to support a process of continuously monitoring the outcomes from these interventions, and hopefully we'll eventually be able to have good impact at scale.
Wonderful. What are the plans for how you might extend this work beyond the meeting you're going to have tomorrow? And how we might actually also build not just on the summary and the resume of policy findings that you've put together that have obviously had so much traction, how we can continue this research, because there's obviously a lot more to be done.
So I think parallel work is needed on both the research and kind of the policy state capacity side. I mean, in terms of the capacity of the system to absorb these findings. So I think, a key part of what we're hoping to do is just build an awareness of how data and research can help the policy making process. And so that's one part of this. And then I think on the research side, we've finished now a body of work in Andhra Pradesh with 5 to 8 years of data, and I'm still writing up a lot of these things. And so I'm probably going to wait another 6 to 9 months before I launch my next big new research stuff. We've just finished a 6-year study on private schools, in many ways anticipating exactly the issues that are going to show up with Clause 12 of the RTE. So in fact, I'll probably come down and do a seminar in NCAER, and that as we talked about at some point. So I think there are 2 or 3 major important thrusts for research going forward. The first is just building systems of longitudinal data collection on student learning outcomes and representative samples at the state level, sort of almost an NSS for education outcomes, but where it's not just a repeated cross-section, but we're following kids over time to get a better understanding of how learning is evolving for cohorts as they pass through the schooling system. So that's kind of a pure data collection exercise. And then I think related to that is then recognizing, so I just presented this paper at Oxford last week, which is at the Young Lives Conference, which is the first paper, stunningly, that's actually following a cohort over 5 years, as they go through the primary schooling system. And what we document...
Is this an AP too?
This is an AP, exactly, right? And I referred to this in my IPF paper, and one of the advantages of me writing the IPF papers, I could cite a lot of working papers that really existed only in my head, because we had the results but didn't have drafts. But it's just staggering, as you see these kids moving through the schooling system, how much you learn about where they get stuck and what's going on with the distribution of learning. So one of the really important findings from that work is that it's only the top 10% of the students who are keeping pace with the syllabus. And in fact, the bottom 10% of students are learning nothing, even though they're spending these extra 3 or 4 years in school. And the middle 80% is kind of trundling along at a rate that's significantly below the syllabus. And so even having this kind of data just provides the system with a reality check of saying, what exactly are we doing with our schooling system if we're putting kids through that and they're not learning anything. So I think having the data and forcing the system to constantly think about the outcomes in a self-reflective way is one of the objectives in this exercise. And once you have that, it's relatively straightforward to build in evaluations of specific interventions. So the government of Haryana has been working with JPAL over the past 2 or 3 years to in fact do evaluations of some of their own programs. And they've been very, it takes a fair bit of work to kind of engage with the government and be there for them. But once you do this, you find that they are in fact quite receptive. So it's a long-term process, this issue of creating capacity both in the supply side for high-quality research and then meeting it on the demand side and making sure that all of this translates into better policy.
Well, let me just say that in this long-term process, we are very much looking forward from NCAER in partnering on this with you. Thank you very much. Lovely.